Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. And on this week's episode, I'm excited to talk to Lincoln Mitchell because we're talking about baseball, which regular listeners know is one of my favorite topics. Lincoln, thank you for coming on the show. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's always wonderful to come on and talk about one of my books, because sometimes when you spend a lot of time writing a book alone, you wonder if anyone, in my case, other than my mother, is going to read it. Thank you for having me on. My name is Lincoln Mitchell. I teach in the Political Science Department and School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. I write on topics including foreign policy, domestic politics here in the United States, the history and politics of San Francisco, and of course, baseball. And I also have a Substack called Kibitzing with Lincoln that you're welcome to check out.
The book that we're going to be talking about today is The 100 Most Important Players in Baseball History. And I really was excited to see this because, especially after looking at just the summary of it, it's not your typical 100 best players list where they get into a debate over stats and who's better or not. This is a different approach to looking at important players in baseball history. So tell us a little bit about the concept of the book.
The answer lies in your question. You said it's not your typical list of 100 greatest players, which is to say everyone's done the 100 greatest. And the world doesn't need, frankly, another middle-aged white guy pointing out that, Harmon Killebrew was or was not better than Manny Ramirez or something like that. And also my strength as a baseball writer is the synergy between my background as a scholar of politics and history with baseball. And here I looked at players who had an impact, through whom we can tell the story of baseball, but also bigger stories. So this includes some players that would easily be on anybody's list of 100 greatest: Willie Mays, Babe Ruth, Henry Aaron, Jackie Robinson, but also include players who were very good players who probably wouldn't make that list, but had a huge impact on the game. Felipe Alou is somebody like that. And also players who, frankly, weren't all that good, but are extremely important for other reasons, or help us understand the history of baseball as an institution on its own, but also as an American cultural institution. And that would include people like Mo Berg, or Hal Chase, or Eddie Goodell, as well as people like Elisa Nakin and Ela Borders, who were women who never had the chance to play in the major leagues. And of course, people like Josh Gibson or Cristobal Torriente, who were men who, because of their racial background, the color of their skin, never had a chance to play in the major leagues.
And I love that approach. This was a lot of fun to read because I learned a ton, for one, but also it really put a lot of the various aspects of baseball and culture and politics, and it brings a lot of things together in a way that maybe a lot of people haven't really connected or put that focus on. And it was really interesting to see how a lot of those came together, especially in the early years where there was a lot of change and development, and about a lot of those early players and how they influenced the development of baseball in general and bringing it closer to what we know it to be today.
Yes, and I find it frustrating when you'll have, I once saw a list on ESPN of the 20 greatest moments in baseball history, and 18 of them happened after the year 2000. And part of what makes baseball such a fascinating American institution is its role in our history. Now, I made arbitrary cutoffs, and I'll just point three out because it will help listeners understand the book more. You had to have played at the highest level available to you from 1900 on. So there's not the kind of prehistory of baseball. Secondly, these are players. So the people like Effa Manley, Marvin Miller, Bill Veeck, who might be in the book for their influence on the game, are not in the book because they weren't players. And thirdly, I made the book in alphabetical order because I didn't want an argument who was more influential. The argument should be why is so-and-so not in the book, not why is so-and-so number 71 instead of, 73. The early story of baseball is fascinating, especially that it wasn't obvious we were going to get to where we are. So people like Rube Foster, who is really the father of what became the Negro Leagues, are massively important. He happened to have been a great pitcher, too, as a younger man. But he helped create an institution that was so central to African-American life for decades. And then it faded away as baseball changed. But the story of baseball at its highest level is not just the major leagues. So Lefty O'Doul, who, by the way, was a wonderful hitter. There's a film coming out by John Leonidakis about Lefty O'Doul. I'm very much looking forward to seeing that. But Lefty O'Doul had a .349 career batting average in the major leagues. That's higher than Babe Ruth or Ted Williams, and he played in the late 20s and early 30s. But he went back and forth because he could make more money and was happier playing for the San Francisco Seals in the Pacific Coast League. And that tells you something about what baseball was like. I'm from San Francisco. And when I started going to games in the mid-'70s, there were older guys who would always tell me that they'd had Major League Baseball there before the Giants. Part of their understanding of baseball was the Pacific Coast League, and the Seals were like the Yankees of the PCL. And also, O'Doul is instrumental in bringing baseball to Japan. So he wouldn't make your list of 100 greatest because he didn't really play long enough at the highs for the New York Giants or something. But without him, you can't tell the story of baseball on the West Coast or even baseball internationally as a global phenomenon.
Well, and I loved that you brought so much of that into this. So much of it was telling the story of baseball through these players and not just their stats and their accomplishments in numerical form. I found it very accessible for anybody who wants to look into this. Gave a nice explanation at the beginning of some of the statistics that you do focus on, which was helpful. But we get a lot of the stories of the players and how the players affected the development of baseball. I'm a story person. I write fiction. So I'm always drawn to interesting people and life stories and just conflicts and challenges. And you really bring a lot of that out. You know, a lot of these are 2 to 3 pages for each player. And you packed a lot into each player's, the summary of their contributions to baseball in that. And I really appreciated and loved that focus. I felt like I was really getting to know both the players and the time that they played in and how that impacted everything that came after them.
One of my goals here was to write a book that was accessible from anyone from the person who has spent their life studying baseball to somebody who knows baseball is important but doesn't know a lot about its history. So I had to do a couple things. Now, the way I structured this is a series of essays, 900 words or so on 100 players. That's about a 5 or 6 minute read. Of course, it's time 100, so you can't read the whole book in 5 minutes. But it's bite-sized chunks. I was thinking of someone like me. If I was encountering one of these players for the first time, the first thing I would want to know is, how good were they? So, for example, to identify one player that comes to mind is Hank Greenberg. Part of what makes Hank Greenberg a fascinating person to me, and also sometimes overlooked, is just how good he was. So I wanted to get your basic batting average, home run numbers there. I know that a lot of people aren't captivated by this notion of WAR, wins above a replacement, or OPS plus, which is a standardized measure of on-base percentage, plus batting average. But over time, that gives us a way to compare players over eras. So I could say something like Greenberg's OPS plus of 143 was similar to Miguel Cabrera's. That gives a reader, a sense of how to compare. But what makes Hank Greenberg interesting is not that he was a great, fearsome right-handed slugger, and he was that. What makes him interesting is, as you point out, as a story. And early on when I started writing baseball books, a reviewer said, in a complimentary way, frankly, baseball fans like baseball stories. Those of us who read baseball books over the years, for decades, we like the stories. We want to read about a player. You pick up a biography of a player and you know many of the facts already. If you were to pick up a biography of Jackie Robinson or Babe Ruth, you know the outline of the story. But you want to get one story about a conversation between Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays before a Dodgers-Giants game in the 50s. Might change how you think about both players and how you think about baseball. And that was my goal here, and I think we can understand a lot. I mentioned Eddie Gaedel earlier, but Eddie Gaedel's one pinch-hitting appearance with the St. Louis Browns. Eddie Gaedel, for those who don't know, was a little person who the owner of the team, Bill Veeck, had pinch hit in the early 1950s as kind of a stunt. And he was ordered not to swing the bat, and he drew a walk. But for me, that story tells us so much about the crisis of baseball in the 1950s. 1950s are often presented as the golden era of baseball, which is true in the 5 boroughs of New York City. But otherwise, Major League Baseball, the National American League, were really struggling. And the fact that an owner would be pushed to do something like that because they just had no other way to bring fans in tells us a lot. A similar story, one of my favorites, is Jackie Mitchell. No relationship. And Jackie Mitchell was a young left-handed pitcher who, in the early 1930s, in a barnstorming game, struck out back-to-back Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. And for me, the one thing this story tells us right away is how important barnstorming was. So we think of, baseball today and Shohei Ohtani or Mookie Betts playing for the Dodgers, and they're great players. And if you want to see them, there's so many ways. You can go to the MLB app. You can just look at the highlights the next day online. And if they're in the World Series, it's on national major network television. But back then, the only way you could see Babe Ruth was photographs in the newspaper and to go to Yankee Stadium, Philadelphia, wherever he was playing with the Yankees, as a member of the Yankees. So the other way that you saw players like this was barnstorming, which many fans today don't really understand what it was. And then Jackie Mitchell, today it's very common to hear people say, well, it must have been a stunt. How could the 17-year-old woman strike out, these 2 great hitters? But I think if you understand, I use her example to explain to voters as a story. The quality of pitching outside of the great pitchers in the 1930s wasn't very good. And both Ruth and Gehrig struck out more against left-handers. I showed that there's statistics that prove that. And I say, maybe this is true. And the beauty of that story is that we don't know. We'll never know if it's true or not. But it tells us a lot about baseball, which then in turn tells us a lot about what America was like back then.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was something that I also found really fascinating, just getting this better look at the social and cultural examples of this time, that big names that everybody's heard, even if they aren't particular baseball fans. Ty Cobb, especially reading about Ty Cobb, I knew who he was, knew, the basics information about him, but reading about his personality and how he played the game and some of that was like that was part of that time period. And some of those early players, at one point you said it was a mean game and that's how they played it. That was part of the culture of baseball, and that was reflecting the overall social factors and cultural elements of the time, and how much that has changed, and how violent some of these interactions during games could be. Almost attacking a fan or going after a ref, where, today that's unthinkable. The consequences of that would be very severe, as we're at a time that was a little more common. It was a different kind of game because American culture was different as well.
I want to also just point out that players in this book go from people like Ty Cobb in the first decade of the 20th century through to guys like Mike Trout and Shohei Ohtani and Buster Posey, who are active or very recently active. So it's not just a book about, the early days. But you're right. And when I think about Ty Cobb, and I'm really only having this thought now for the first time, what's fascinating about Cobb is that until Babe Ruth really ends up with the Yankees, moves to the outfield full time, and just becomes the greatest player ever, if you stop the clock in 1919, Ty Cobb is the greatest player ever. But Cobb was never a celebrity the way Ruth was. And that's partially because of the dramatic difference in their personality. Ty Cobb was an angry, bigoted man who today would have been urged to get help at a young age. Babe Ruth was, a bit of a party animal, but basically he was garrulous, he was fun, people liked to be around him. He was playing in New York, but also it was a different historical moment. He plays in the early days of the mass media, and Cobb essentially plays just before that. To me, Babe Ruth is one of the most important Americans in cultural history of the United States because he's in some respects the first American celebrity. And that's a fascinating thing. I have an audio recording from the mid-1990s of my late grandfather telling a story, half in Yiddish, which was his native language, in English, about a new Jewish immigrant going to the Bronx to see Babe Ruth play, in front of a vaudeville act with a punchline and everything. But that's how important Babe Ruth was culturally. And that tells us about celebrity. And this is a country that is, where the culture of celebrity is so massive. It's also interesting your point about arguing and fighting with umpires, because George Brett is in this book. And there are a number of players in this book: George Brett, Cal Ripken Jr., these are more recent players, Ernie Banks. And they're in this book substantially because of their connection to one city and one team. And that's also part of baseball history. That guys like Ernie Banks are institutions in Chicago and become part of the history of that city in such a deep way. But Brett is in there because of his role as a Kansas City Royal, but also because of the Pine Tar game. And I went back and I watched that video on YouTube while I was researching the book. And what strikes me about that video is exactly what you said. His behavior there, even 40 years later, not only would it not be tolerated, in any workplace in America, it wouldn't be tolerated. He has this violent tantrum. And it's fascinating because I was in high school when that happened. And when you're a child, I think becoming interested in baseball, one of the things that's fascinating is it's kind of real life and it's kind of not. So grown men are allowed to scream profanities, kick dirt on each other, throw balls at people's heads in a way that could kill them, and have tantrums like that, which almost seem unreal. You watch it, if you were new to baseball, you might say this has got to be theater. Like no grown man actually behaves like this in real life and gets away with it. So that to me was also a fascinating look at the development of kind of the emotional side of the game, as you point out.
Yeah, it made me think back to, I was watching one of the Dodgers games the other night, and I think maybe Will Smith was not liking some of the calls that were being made, and kind of as the next batter's coming up, it was just like this look and this little frown and head shake, and the announcers are like, oh, he's not having this, he's feeling frustrated. And it was like that tiny, subtle indication of displeasure, and they're like, oh. And reading some of these, I was like, wow, that's changed a lot.
Imagine if, I'm thinking as a professor, a student doesn't like the grade. If they came into my office and had a tantrum like that, we would probably call security. And I don't want to say call the police because this particular moment it's kind of probably not the right thing to say regarding Colombia, but we would probably call security of some kind. And here it's just like he gets a little tiny little suspension and the league rules in his favor, even though on the issues Brett was completely wrong. Like the Yankees were right, the Royals were wrong.
I think coming back to what we were saying earlier of just seeing those changes in baseball and seeing those social changes as well. We're in a time period right now where I think we're kind of swinging the other direction in a lot of arenas with politics, like you were saying, with some of the demonstrations going on right now. And we're, I think, kind of re-examining where that boundary lies, which is interesting to watch. I've been fascinated by some of the stories and just kind of seeing how this has all developed. That was something that you kind of had a theme throughout the book of what's going on in the country and what's going on kind of in the wider world and how that's affecting the changes that are going along through baseball. And of course, you bring up a lot, racism and how that affected the segregation and everything in baseball and who we could see going into steroids and just so many factors of things that as a country we're dealing with, and you see those reflected in sports, and it plays a part in that development over time.
I think that's right. And I would also add to that list labor. Right now we are seeing a revival of the labor movement. But one of the most powerful labor unions in the country is the MLBPA, the Major League Baseball Players Association, and the history of how that union came about. And I trace it, really one of the key moments that's often overlooked is Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale having a holdout in the beginning of spring training in 1966. They wanted $1 million each over 3 years, and they ended up getting less than that, but still a lot for the time. And that's the first collective bargaining. That's where one player joins with at least one other player and says, we're going to work together and we're going to have solidarity and we're going to get what we want. And within a few years or within a few months, you have Marvin Miller running the Players Association. And then you have these other players. In the book, I talk about Curt Flood, of course, Catfish Hunter. And Catfish Hunter is a fascinating figure for other reasons. And then also Andy Messersmith, who kind of paved the way for free agency. And that's also a hugely important labor story. I think for me, race, ethnicity, and I would add globalization. The story of those three ideas is so central to the evolution of baseball in such a fascinating way. And we don't have time to go over all of this, but there are many players in the book. Felipe Alou, Roberto Clemente, Hank Greenberg, and Sandy Koufax, who I've already mentioned, but also Joe DiMaggio. And one fascinating example of this is the San Francisco Giants of 1965, who have, among the players on that team, are Willie Mays, who is at that time the longest tenured African-American baseball player in the major leagues. And obviously Willie Mays is Willie Mays, right? This is one of the greatest players ever. This is an enormously important cultural figure. Willie McCovey, who's in the book for other reasons. Juan Marichal, who is the first great Dominican player elected to the Hall of Fame. They've just traded away Felipe Alou, who was the first player raised in the Dominican Republic to play in the Major League. And of course, anyone who is a student of 1960s baseball knows that in 1965 is the infamous game where Juan Marichal and John Roseboro, the Dodgers catcher, in the shadow of the uprising in Watts and political turmoil in the Dominican Republic, have a big fight on the field that concludes with Marichal clobbering Roseboro on the head with the bat, which is, the most violent thing that ever happened on a Major League Baseball field. Deliberately violent. I mean, obviously Carl Mays threw a ball that killed Ray Chapman, but I would put that in a different category. And the fascinating thing about that game for me, like the quirky trivia thing that just brings it all together, is the Giants end up winning that game because Willie Mays, of course, hits a 3-run home run after the fight has settled down. With 1 out in the 9th inning, Marichal gets thrown out of the game, of course. They bring in a relief pitcher named Ron Herbel, a journeyman who pitches fine, but he can't get through the last 2 outs of the 9th inning. With 1 out in the 9th inning, who do the Giants bring in to get the save? Masanori Murakami. And Masanori Murakami is in the book because he is the first Japanese major league player. So you see in that one game how the globalization of baseball is beginning to really kick in and change everything. You have a guy who becomes a legendary figure in the Dominican Republic. I've had so many conversations with large Dominican population here in New York, sometimes with people who have no interest in baseball. They all know who Juan Marichal is. Murakami, today, imagine baseball today without guys like Shohei Ohtani or more recently Ichiro Suzuki. They contribute so much to the game, and it all comes together there. And not least, I believe, if you make a list of the 100 most important, influential Jews in American history, Sandy Koufax is on that list. So much of the story of, we hope, is the curve in the right direction with regards to racial tolerance and religious tolerance and breaking down bigotries comes together. You can tell that story through baseball, and amazingly, it comes together in some fascinating ways in one ball game almost 60 years ago.
What a way to show that. to see these players and hear their stories in this context. I thought that that was a lot of fun to see as well. There was some documentary I was watching about basketball. I think it was a 30 for 30. And they were talking about how over the history of basketball, you've seen a lot of minority players using sports as a way to advance socially and economically. And you could kind of see what the cultural and racial biases were of the time looking at the players. And at one time, it was a lot of Jewish players in basketball because they had a hard time finding, successful work. And it's gone through these stages where you see the country and where those biases and where that racism is. And it made me think back to that and then thinking how much, especially in baseball, reading this, how much that limited the competition, the access to these wonderful players that most people never got a chance to see, and to see these players play together as well. And how neat that is to see that develop over time and see more countries and more players coming in and really getting to showcase the talent and everything.
And if you're watching Major League Baseball over the last 30 years, you are seeing the best baseball players in the world. But that was never true before that. If you're watching Major League Baseball in 1940 or 1930, you're watching many of the best white American players, a small handful of Latinos who are phenotypically white so they can play. They're allowed to play in the major leagues. And you're even losing some of the players from the West Coast who can make more money playing out there. And that's why the story of baseball in the pre-Jackie Robinson era, if you limit it to the National American League, you're missing the whole story. To pick a player who is well-known, Satchel Paige, he played games with how old he was, but most of our evidence shows that he was born in 1906. So as a 41 or 42-year-old rookie, he comes in, and people think of him as second African-American in the American League after his teammate Larry Doby, who was a great player. But what people forget about Satchel Paige is at that age, he becomes the top reliever on a Cleveland team that finishes the season in a tie for first place and wins the one-game playoff and then wins the World Series. And I'm sorry to my Cleveland Guardian fan friends, but that's the last time they've won the World Series. And they never win that World Series without Larry Doby playing center field and without Satchel Paige, who is not a joke at 41 years old, is still mowing down American League hitters. In 1963, and now at the age of 57, Paige has retired and has been barnstorming. Charlie O'Finley, another fascinating baseball character, is the owner of the Kansas City Athletics, and he brings Paige back as kind of a stunt. He's now 57 years old. And what does Satchel Paige do? They start him. He pitches 3 innings of shutout baseball. Shutout baseball at 57 years old. I mean, I'm 56 years old. I don't know if I could throw 20 pitches from 60 and a half feet away, and I'm in pretty good shape. The only hit he gives up is to Carl Yastrzemski, who was, and Carl Yastrzemski got hits off of everybody, right? A teammate of his, this is a great trivia question. I'm going to give you the answer to the listeners, but this is the only time they had 2 players who were inducted to the Hall of Fame as players on the same team where one was 3 times as old as the other. Because Catfish Hunter, who later is in the book for reasons of culture, but also reasons of free agency, is a 19-year-old rookie on that team. So to me, this is just a wonderful story. I love these players who connect the generations. But also what that leads me to think is, my goodness, how good was Satchel Paige in the 1930s? And he was essentially relegated to, unfortunately, a kind of second-class status where if you were watching the Negro League Baseball, if you were African-American at that time, Satchel Paige, you knew he was the best pitcher around. If you were a fan of, Ted Williams or Stan Musial and really understood baseball in America, you wanted to see these guys face off against each other, assuming you weren't a terrible racist. But the racist institutions prevented fans, I wasn't alive, from seeing the best. And that went on for decades until 1947, and really after 1947, because teams were still limited, right? There was an understanding, don't have more than 3 African-American players on the same team. And basically, you kind of had to be a star in the 50s to stick around because there weren't too many African-American backup catchers. The team just said, for that position, we'll get a white person. The competition we didn't see. So if you want to understand baseball, you have to look beyond the National and American League.
Well, it really makes you wonder what baseball would look like today had there not been the racism and some of the other issues that if more players had been able to play, because it not only changes the people who are interested, it changes a lot of the dynamics and the politics and just the progression of skill when you're playing against higher levels of competition.
Let's go back to that period when the National American League began integrating in the late 40s and early 50s, because there's another question there as well. What we saw right away is that guys like Jackie Robinson, Willie Mays, and Orestes Munoz, they come in and they change the game because they're stealing bases. They're making the game fun again, because baseball had become very moribund. And that's why nobody was going to the games in the 50s if you weren't in New York. If you had Mickey Mantle and Yogi Berra on the same team, you found a way to get to Yankee Stadium if you were a baseball fan. They enlivened the game, and the game would have been very different if that kind of baseball had been welcomed decades earlier, because there's this period at the end of the dead ball era when the stolen base fades away and it just is taken over by slugging. And it wasn't as interesting. But I would say there's another way to think of that question. Jackie Robinson is obviously one of the 100 most important players ever in baseball history, but he's probably one of the 100 most important Americans. And the reason is not just because he was the first African-American to play in the National League with the Brooklyn Dodgers, everyone knows that story, but because of when it happened. Jackie Robinson played for the Dodgers before the sit-ins in the South, before the Freedom Summer, before Brown versus Board of Education, certainly before the Voting Rights Act, before the Civil Rights Act. Really, as the Civil Rights Act, which finally brought down the segregation and the suppression, at least legally, is just in its embryonic stage. Jackie Robinson is playing in the World Series for the Brooklyn Dodgers. So he is so important in the civil rights movement because it happens before everything. And, Jackie Robinson, let's put him aside, but if Oscar Charleston or Satchel Paige had been doing that in the 20s, it might have accelerated the civil rights movement here overall because baseball was such an important cultural institution. I mean, that's a theme in the book that I try to play with a lot because it's one of the things that continues to fascinate me. Today, baseball is a much bigger business than ever, but it is not as important culturally. And that's why guys like Jackie Robinson, but also people like Joe DiMaggio are so important because of what he meant to Italian Americans who also suffered pretty nasty prejudice during this period. And you know that through some of the ways DiMaggio himself was described. I mean, the writers felt compelled to point out that he didn't smell like garlic because he was Italian American. And that was kind of a bigoted stereotype about Italian Americans. But I want to make another point about Joe DiMaggio, which I think captures this cultural issue. In 1991, DiMaggio had been retired for 40 years. There's a television program called Seinfeld, which people my age know. I don't know if younger people are familiar with. It's a fascinating program for a lot of reasons. It's the last sitcom before cell phones take over the world. There's an episode in 1991 where two of the main characters, Kramer and Elaine, claim to have seen Joe DiMaggio in the donut shop. And Kramer, who's kind of the goofy character, describes how gracefully Joe DiMaggio was dunking his donut in his coffee. What struck me, because I watched this rerun when I was writing this book, is that in 1991, it was entirely plausible. You would assume that most of your readership would know who Joe DiMaggio, who hadn't played in 40 years, was. And it was entirely plausible that somebody who was a character roughly in their 30s, too young to have seen DiMaggio play, would recognize him. That tells you how important baseball was to the culture. Mike Trout is in the book. Mike Trout's one of the greatest players ever. He got hurt the other day, but still one of the greatest players ever. I'm meeting a friend for coffee at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning in my neighborhood here in New York. If Mike Trout stands behind me in line, I'll be the only person at that cafe, no matter how crowded it is, to recognize. And that tells you the changing role of baseball in the culture.
That's so fascinating to think about that, and I'm glad you pointed that out. I could talk about this with you for another couple of hours, but we are unfortunately out of time. So
I can talk about it forever. So thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
I am so glad that I got the chance to read this and talk with you. I do want to give you a chance to let readers know where they can find you and where they can find the book online.
Well, thank you. Again, my name is Lincoln Mitchell. I'm a professor at Columbia University. You can find me online at Substack at Kibitzing with Lincoln. I'm on most of the social media platforms as Lincoln Mitchell, Instagram as Lincoln A. Mitchell. My website is lincolnmitchell.com. The book, The 100 Most Important Players in Baseball History, is from Artemisia Press, and you can get this pretty much anywhere online where books are sold. And if you can't find it and you send an email to me through my website, I'll find a way to get you a copy.
Well, thank you so much, and I would love to have you back whenever you're ready with a new project, or if you just want to talk some more baseball again. Let me know.
Well, I appreciate it, and I should let you know and let the viewers know that my next book will be out almost a year from now, and that is a biography of George Moscone, the late mayor of San Francisco, which will be a book about the politics and history of San Francisco.
That's going to be really interesting. I'd love to stay in contact and hear about that when you're a little closer.
Absolutely. I would look forward to that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.